I wasn't originally going to make a retrospective video because unlike space exploration, Seablock's pretty much in its final state, but a lot of people wanted it, and I decided it would make a good excuse for a bit of a base tour, so here it is. So Seablock's essentially an Angel Bob's run, which is community slang for some kind of combination of the various mods by Archangel 666 and Bobbing About, but it also contains a few other mods like the Circuit Processing mod, Science Tweaker, and the whole spaceship research thing. There's also a bunch of custom adjustments to the standard recipes to make them more amenable to the whole seawater only thing. So when discussing Seablock, I think it's important to be cognizant of the fact that it's not exactly trying to be a balanced and accessible experience. And if you want an example of that, look no further than the start of Seablock. You need to sift through all of your recipes until you realize you need to put water into an electrolyzer, vent the gases with 2 flare stacks, crush the slag in a crusher, put that crush into a liquefier to make mineral water, and then put that mineral water into a crystallizer to have a chance at making an ore. If you didn't know that beforehand, it's a bit daunting, and that's not including the fact that you've got to figure out that by washing mud you can get trace amounts of hydrogen sulfide that can be turned into sulfur. Then that the whole process which consumes sulfur and turns it into wastewater actually creates more sulfur than it consumes. I'm glad I didn't know any of that going in so I can experience it for myself. It's an interesting experience, because most other games would just tell you this stuff, but in Seablock all you really have is your instinct that things shouldn't be so horrible. With that assumption, you start combing through the recipes and staring at ratios until you get that eureka moment that is the mineral sludge loop. It's a similar story for the power production. You're stuck at minutes per plate because your only source of materials is electrolyzers, and the 120 turbines you start out with are enough to power maybe 4 or 5 of them. The only way to get power is to burn the cellulose from algae, and so you struggle with that and obsessively flip through the recipes like an overworked lawyer and stumble across flammable fluids. I don't think I need to remind you what that turned into, but he can also burn naphtha and methane, so he could be living in the blue cellulose universe instead of the beans universe. The point is, it's a whole lot of pain, so it's really difficult to judge it by normal standards when it's so clearly meant for morons like me who can't help but take on a challenge just because it's there. Make no mistake, the people who make these mods do it because they know that someone will try to beat it. But it's still important to strike a balance between quality and misery, and I think Seablock does that pretty well. The beginning is definitely the most interesting part, because it's almost like solving a puzzle, but once you solve it, it's like, congratulations, now you get to play the whole rest of the game. For anyone wanting to experience Seablock for themselves, I mentioned it in the first video, but I 100% recommend getting some mod that gives you early access to construction bots, because the number of electrolyzers you need to stand up before we have any hope of getting construction bots is insane. But if I did this again, I definitely wouldn't need it, because I know exactly what I needed, so there wouldn't be much downtime. Outside of the early game, I really like the Smelting. They're mostly from the Angels mods, and the multi-step processes are great without feeling too overwhelming. The ubiquity of mineral sludge is interesting too. The fact that there's one resource that's consumed by pretty much everything tickles me in a good way. It's just really satisfying seeing my sludge trains buzzing about. I really don't know why, but I feel like every time a mod allows me to make molten metal, I love it. It was the same thing when casting machines were added to space exploration. Speaking of space exploration, I mentioned a while back that I thought the multi-step processes there were a little boring, and I didn't really feel that here, even though plenty of the steps are just as simple and have similar gimmicks, such as routing a portion of the output back in as input in the case of gold and aluminum. I think it's partially because even if it only takes one extra ingredient between steps, to get that ingredient I just had to make a train instead of set up an entire rocket on another planet, so it's not as exhausting. Apart from that, all of the byproducts actually have intended methods of disposal, so I didn't need to worry about a warehouse overflowing with landfill after 100 hours. I still think Nullius did byproducts best, where disposal is part of the process itself. If this was Nullius, I'd need to neutralize every toxic gas before I was allowed to vent it to the atmosphere. But Seablock lets you get rid of pretty much every fluid without much of a fuss. Beyond all that and outside of the early game, just the concept of Seablock is kind of neat. There's no mines, no ores, everything is just made out of the one universal fluid of mineral sludge. Once you get a good scalable design for mineral sludge up, it's really quite satisfying just watching it beat like the heart of your base and fill its veins. Plus you never need to worry about your ore patches depleting. That's the important part, good and scalable. You really need to be the type of person who finds it intrinsically satisfying to invest the effort to make designs sophisticated enough to handle the insane science demands of the endgame research. It probably goes without saying, but Seablock isn't for anyone. But that being said, it does a really good job rewarding people who put in the effort. There's a lot of designs that work for multiple processes. Like how I was able to adapt my original ore crystallization design to fit ore floating, leaching, and purification, and use the same one for all the ores. Plus, I was able to use the plastic build to rebuild charcoal, and the same farm design got me ethanol, acetone, and of course, fuel oil. So it's nice to feel rewarded when you try to build something intelligently. With mods this complex, that can't be overstated, and it leads to this nice momentum where even as the recipes get more complicated, so does your ability to tackle them. Accordingly, I was continually punished for not making a design that kickstarts itself every time I put down a new sludge stack. I'm going to bring up space exploration again, but seeing as Seablock's whole gimmick is basically being a B&A run where you're restricted to the most inefficient processes possible, it makes me think about my assertion that SE's multi-surface logistics gimmick would be more interesting if there were complex and annoying ways to compensate for the missing resources on certain planets. Seablock feels a whole lot like that idea, just expanded to an entire mod and you have no other option. Yes, the mod is complex and has more items in one crafting tab than vanilla has in the entire game, but the one thing I appreciate is that everything you need is in fairly large quantities. It might sound like more effort, but considering you're presumably playing this game for fun, when you're forced to make large, scalable designs, naturally you'll end up with something that kinda looks cool. And if you're anything like me, just seeing the items moving around the belts of a massive finished build is a reward in of itself. I mean, take half the designs in my run and imagine if I needed only 1/10 the buildings. They just wouldn't be nearly as interesting. This is also why I generally dislike the vanilla way of handling beacons, and why I purposefully built everything super compact despite massively restricting the space I could fit beacons. Maybe others don't have this proclivity, but I just can't feel satisfied if my design isn't aesthetic. When I was first starting this run, I could only stomach playing for maybe an hour to an hour and a half at a time. It's interesting how Factorio runs always seem to have this tipping point where once you've reached a certain stage, you can pretty much play indefinitely. For me, it was when I got the power armor and the exoskeletons at the start of the second installment, plus a lot of bots and an easily scalable supply hub. I remember complaining about this sort of thing by proxy in my Crastorio run, because the car took oil processing to fuel it unless you chose the special option in the mods menu, and restricting mobility just made it a little bit more exhausting to play. When your brain is full of ideas but your puny exoskeletonless legs can't carry you fast enough to act on them, that's when the fatigue starts to creep in. But once you've got bots, a fully stocked mall, and a zippy suit, the limits are off. The longest time I played in one sitting on this run, not counting the AFKing for the final research, was the 6 hours I spent setting up ferric crystals. The Factorio time warp effect is scary sometimes. Anyway, you know what I really didn't appreciate? Yeah, modules. So I don't really hate them in concept, but that whole thing about getting less fatigued while playing the moment I get the exoskeleton equipment requires having power armor, and the power armor in this mod requires modules. And I always hate it when mods feel like they're holding off on the essentials for a little bit longer than necessary. I'm fine with complexity, but I think the Tier 0 modules shouldn't require bioprocessing and crystal splinters at all, so that the absolute basics are a lot more accessible while it's the higher tiers that you need to work harder for. It's well and above any other challenge present in this mod, and it feels a bit weird for it to gatekeep not the victory condition, but modules. And it creates the inevitable result that they will be summarily avoided until the absolute end of the game when you have no choice, and that makes it difficult to grow the base naturally around modules. The modules don't get more difficult with each tier, every tier is equally as annoying and have almost identical recipes, so if you're making tier 1s, you might as well be making tier 3s too. That's not to mention the fact that because the biter breeding far surpasses the crystal production of fish and puffers, there's no incentive to make a proper build for them because it's just going to get replaced anyway. So again, it's not really the complexity I'm against, it's that it's an inconsistently difficult process that affects every other aspect of the run whose design punishes you for setting it up early. Also, why can't you crush the polished splinters? That's really the only thing I've got any major complaints about. I mean, if Seablock advertised itself like any other overhaul mod, I'd have heaps of concerns, but it's more of a challenge format of an existing mod, so some CBT is to be expected. And what unique challenges the mod adds are actually pretty interesting, without being like, you know, one of my challenges. Going into it blind is a neat experience, one that obviously you can't replicate now that you've watched this far, but then again, maybe it's all dribbled out of your ears by the time I set up resin for the 3rd time. Anyway, since there's so many recipes, there's this freedom to how you approach things, like me choosing bioresin and slowly regretting it, or making plastic from nothing but plants. Some people might choose geode washing for their mineral sludge, while some people choose slag and electrolyzers. It admittedly makes it more incomprehensible, and requires shuffling through recipes for several minutes before you're confident enough to build anything, which would be bad if this weren't tailored specifically to Factorio veterans. Because of that, it's more of a novel experience. There's also the satisfaction of finding out ways to deal with things, like turning the spare mud back into mud water to create a loop, or composting compost, or breaking down the byproducts of the waste washing. It's always satisfying to feel like you're making progress and actively improving as time goes on, and gaining this weird expertise within a single run is something that only these 300-hour mods can manage. But then you win. It's like reading an epic fantasy series and becoming intimately familiar with the socio-economic impact of the tax haven imposed upon the peasantry by the 5th Archduke of Applebee's, and the book ends and you're like, now what do I do with this knowledge? Okay, that was a bit of a tangent, but I really did like the smelting the most, and farming in general is something interesting not present in the base game, and handled pretty well, I think. It wasn't too complicated, but required volume and could be the starting point of many complex processes. Actually, I just remembered the plant samples. Okay, those things were painful. If I was going to play this again, which I won't, I'd definitely make a latch that stops the inserter into the seed extractors from picking up another garden until the process is finished. When I was doing smelting, I made it so that everything is contained to one process and mineral sludge is the resource moved around, so all I had to do was paste the entire block again if I wanted more production. But another way could have been to make all the crushed ores in one central spot and move those around instead. There's a lot of possibilities, and that's good. Makes it a dynamic challenge. Regardless, I liked how it was possible to make these really complicated but contained processes that only output one metal. And slowly going through and unlocking more and more advanced metals felt like some neat progression. I understand that I'm weird, but the very existence of different colors of metal to put on belts makes me excited. The casting machines being a way to eke out some more productivity is neat, and a good incentive to upgrade without forcing it, and making the metal coils more compact and effective to transport was a good bonus too. I feel like I'm rambling a bit, but hey, you asked for it. What else is there? Oh yeah, I hate how all the sciences have crazy names, so I can't just type science into the production tab and monitor the production and consumption of all of them simultaneously. Also, those alien artifacts are a pain, but a non-issue in the grand scheme of things. The ending is definitely a bit anticlimactic compared to something like space exploration or Craft Oreo 2, especially considering that it took 300 hours to get a text box. But as a wise man once said, it's not the destination that matters, but the torture along the way. That was me. I said that. Right now. But that's why I felt it necessary to splice in some space exploration footage at the end for some nice closure. Also, here's some extra lore. I was originally building my own ship, but then my power went out and I lost 20 minutes of progress, so I downloaded the first ship I found from factorialprints.com. It's a pretty good ship, though. Though the waiting at the end was definitely boring, I respect that it succeeded in its ultimate goal of forcing me to build an extremely large base, because if not for the threat of a million science research looming overhead, I wouldn't have put nearly as much effort into building the base. And I'm glad the mod gave me the trains necessary to act on my demented thoughts in the form of rail networks without being too overpowered. I think a mod like this looks a lot more overwhelming than it actually is. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's pretty rough, but once you've bootstrapped yourself up, you can start to design around trains, and suddenly when a recipe calls for 10 different ingredients, you just smile to yourself knowing that it's only a train stop away. I'd shudder to think what a main bus base would look like in this mod. Anyway, this mod, I give it the final score of beans out of 10. And man, I feel like I barely managed to show any of this base before I ran out of things to say. Well, if you want to look at it yourself, it's up on my Patreon just like all my other saves. Okay, bye.